I just want to welcome everyone to join us for this afternoon's presentation from Palisades Village. On a housekeeping note, if you wouldn't mind keeping yourself muted during the presentation. If you have questions, we welcome them at the end, or you can put them in the chat box. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Lozier, a member of our events committee, who organized this talk with Anne Satterthwaite.
Thank you, Erica. Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's book talk with Anne Satterthwaite. Anne's book is called Local Glories, Opera Houses on Main Street Where Art and Community Meet. These opera houses were symbols of pride in towns all across America, starting quite early in the 19th century and continuing into the 20th. Anne graduated from Yale University with a degree in city planning, and she worked in environmental planning, historic preservation, and cultural planning. One of her projects in Washington, D.C. was as an organizer of the Georgetown Waterfront Park.
You bet, 40 years.
Anne sees the village movement as an important way to stimulate community life, and she is a founding member of the Georgetown Village. Welcome, Anne. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. Am I on now?
Yes, you're on now.
When the Metropolitan Opera House opened in October 1883 with much fanfare, the residents of Fort Edward, New York's Opera House had already been enjoying concerts and plays for over 13 years at this Bradley Opera House. That's it. This was just one of tens of thousands of opera houses built in towns and cities in this country after the Civil War until the early 20th century. Matching the number of opera houses were thousands of traveling theater and opera groups, lecturers, minstrel shows, lyceums, magicians, circuses, and 500 comedy troupes performing only Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was the heyday of the opera house and the golden age of live entertainment. It was also the time of massive changes. The country was healing after the Civil War and fast becoming an urbanized industrial power. As the railroad crossed the country and laced it with branch lines, vast stretches of the Western territories were filling up with newcomers and many new immigrants. Bivouacs of settlements were morphing into towns and yearning to become grander places. This is in Sargent, Nebraska. Their town fathers hoped that an opera house might provide a patina of respectability to their new settlements. Here in Wamego, Kansas, at the same time, western parts of the eastern states did not want to be left out, so they were building opera houses too, many incorporated in town halls. And then older halls were being renamed opera houses. Fortunately for theater and entertainment, the rigid puritanical strictures about the evils of theater going were slowly being overlooked. However, the influence of the Puritans and later the Quakers and many other religious groups was simply remarkable. Not until 1937 did the Methodists remove their theater going as an evil activity from their guiding principles. Theater was seen as corrupting the soul, interfering with the Calvinist work ethic, and offering deceptive activities. Theater was considered subversive, so early plays in the North were not in theaters, but in lecture halls or museums or exhibition halls where plays were described as moral dialogues. The South, fortunately, was not tainted with its hatreds, so theater flourished there, attracting many Northern actors. But as the population became more diverse and settlers moved westward, away from the grip of rigid puritanical ways, theater and entertainment were becoming accepted. Yet even with this relaxed attitude toward theater, new halls of entertainment were not called theaters, but opera houses. Aside from skirting the name theater, naming these new halls opera houses added a veneer of respectability to new and old towns. As soon as a town had a bank, some stores, and a hotel in the newly settled areas of the country, the town fathers, often just one local entrepreneur, would build an opera house. For all towns, whether small or large, but especially for the straggling new communities, the opera house became a symbol of civilization. As a lawyer in Central City, Colorado wrote in 1866, This is our mission of the mountain climb, a truer mode of life to win, to trace the vestiges of vice and crime, to welcome culture and refinement in. And in 1878, Central City did get an opera house, which is still operating today with Grand Opera. It's quite close to Denver. It's extremely successful. For many, the opera house was more than a symbol of refinement. It was a commercial venture to put a town on the map. Local boosters hoped it would lure a branch line of the railroad to their town, attract new settlers, or even make the town a candidate for a county seat or the state capital. Among opera house promoters were the local leaders and orphan women who nudged the men in their lives to bring culture to their towns. These new opera houses became sources of enormous pride. In the newly settled town of Crete, Nebraska, the local newspaper reported in 1877 on the recently built Band's Opera House that, quote, "It seems almost incredible that so fine a hall can stand out as an important building on ground so lately part of Jesse Bickle's cornfield." In the more sophisticated town of Paris, Kentucky, the local newspaper wrote on the opening of its opera house in 1890 that it, quote, "It makes me feel that we breathe the very atmosphere of music, that we drink in the spirits of immortal drama produced by Goethe, Wagner, and other illustrious composers of the divine art." Superlatives abounded in the descriptions of the new halls. They confirmed the material accomplishments and the cultural aspirations of a town. Often a town would have a series of opera houses, 3 or 4 in a 40-year period, as many were destroyed by fires from gas lights. However, they were quickly rebuilt. And aside from replacing fire-struck buildings, towns often wanted bigger and better halls to reflect their improved economic and social status, and often their aggrandized self-image. Opera houses came in many sizes. The simplest halls were framed, one-room ground floor buildings. Yeah, it's this one, it's 7. Those remain, in any case, most of them have disappeared and been replaced by better halls. Those that remain have been fancied up with technical equipment, wider prosceniums, and even artistic details like stenciling. This was number 7. In any case, that is in near Madison, Wisconsin, and it's a thriving summer community, and it's very active. I was there in the winter, nothing was happening. Anyway, many opera houses in small towns with population of over less than 2,000 were over the store and the upper stories of a 2 or 3 story building, often embedded in a commercial block, as in Red Cloud, Nebraska. This is where Willa Cather lived, and that is quite a typical array of 2-story brick buildings with the opera house is on the little parapet in the middle. And you can see there's a door, 2 doors underneath it, the hardware store and a grocery store on the ground floor. And then you go up a steep flight of stairs to a flat floored hall. And this hall was built by a local builder for the owners of the hardware store and grocery store, who were both located on the ground floor. The doors that led up these doors and that one door, brownish door in the center, would lead up to steep steps to the opera house on the 2nd floor. Here there would be a small lobby with a ticket office, and beyond the opera house was a flat floored rectangular room with a stage at one end, scene wings, a drop curtain, small dressing rooms, and movable stairs. As modest as it sounds, it seemed very grand to Willa Cather and other Red Cloud citizens. Such flat-floored halls provided a flexibility for a variety of community activities, from plays and entertainments to sports and town meetings. In larger towns, up to 5,000 people, the opera house might be 3 stories high, seating at least several hundred people, as in Cambridge, New York. That's correct. The next one, that is in David City, Nebraska. These buildings would be frame of brick with commercial establishments on the 1st floor, at least 1 balcony, several adequate dressing rooms, winged scenes, a drop curtain, a trap door, and often flat floors with movable chairs. Many were in commercial blocks on Main Street, like the situation in Cambridge, New York, which is the last photograph you've seen. The next level of opera house is a 3 or 4 story brick or stone building, like the Love Opera House in Fremont, Nebraska with a population of over 7,000. The Love, as many mid-sized opera houses, was architect design and could seat over 1,000 people, had several balconies, boxes, frescoed prosceniums, a fly gallery, raked floor, several trapdoors, and the case goes on, an orchestra pit, and its velvet opera chairs, which could accommodate a hat and umbrella. All of these halls would have their own opera house orchestra. Like the small opera houses, retail stores would be on the ground floor, providing some income to offset the often unprofitable opera house operations. The largest and most luxurious opera houses were the grand opera houses. That is in Kearney, Nebraska. It's a railroad junction, right? Over 1,000 people, 10,000 people. The next one is in Denver, Colorado. These opera houses could seat more than 1,000 people in fancy opera chairs. I don't know whether they could take the umbrellas though. And gilded halls with the latest in technology for mechanical and stage equipment, raked floors, elaborate chandeliers, boxes, fortified trapdoors, fancy prosceniums, orchestra pits for the house orchestra. Some of these grand opera houses, like Pueblos in Denver, were embedded in large buildings, like the Chicago's 1889 auditorium, with offices, hotels, and stores surrounding the entertainment hall. In the city of Pueblo, with a population that is right on the range, is a population of 25,000. Its grand opera house is the fourth in a succession of opera houses. Was designed in 1890 by one of the best known teams of architects at the time, Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler. Seated 1,200 people, the hall glittered with gold ornamentation and incorporated the latest in engineering principles, such as clear sight lines. Its balconies did not require supporting pillars. However, they scrimped on fireproofing. Despite its stone fortress exterior, the magnificent building burned down in February 1922 when frigid rain weather froze the hoses, preventing the firemen from extinguishing the blaze. However, for 32 years, this grand opera house was a symbol of pride for Pueblo. Aside from architecture, the siting of many opera houses added to their prominent role in the communities. Both the Goodspeed Opera House in East Haddam, Connecticut, on the Connecticut River, and the Stonington Opera House overlooking Stonington, Maine Harbor, have commanding views of both the nearby water while also being located on Main Street. Other halls with less dramatic settings might be located on the brow of a hill or at an important intersection. The interiors of the opera houses varied from very simple and utilitarian to grand and elegant. Some were even modeled after New York theaters. Most were simple halls like Red Cloud, Nebraska's, which was getting ready for high school graduation. And this one is in Cambridge, New York, which could be quite elegant with chandeliers and a fastly decorated scheme, but no orchestra pit. The city of Burlington, on the other hand, had a grand interior with raked floors, boxes, orchestra pit decorated, and several trap doors. Yeah, that's it, number 19. Although the building still stands and dominates the pedestrianized Church Street, it now houses offices. Interestingly, some towns overcame their antipathy to theater and located the opera houses in their town halls in places as scattered as Dothan, Alabama. That's Bozeman, Montana. The next one is Claremont, New Hampshire, and the next one is Vergennes, Vermont. The town offices would usually be on the first floor with the opera house above. Here, in these opera houses, the manager would often be a town-paid employment, an early indication of public support for the arts, in a state where there were puritanical vestiges still. Another variation would be a library combined with an opera house. Some Carnegie libraries had music halls, but the most prominent combined opera house and library is the Haskell, which straddles the Canadian border at Derby Line, Vermont, and Stanton, Quebec. That black line you see on the floor is the boundary between the United States and Canada. In any case, Mineral Point, Wisconsin has an all-purpose municipal hall, which is still functioning. Here, the city offices, the public library, and the opera house are all housed in the same building. and it is functioning today. Extremely influential in the culture of the towns and cities were the many immigrants settling in this country in the late 19th century. These immigrants introduced the love of music and opera from their homelands and their new communities, which helped thaw the rigid attitudes toward art and culture. As the Germans, Czechs, Swedes, and many others clustered in time, they established their own halls. The Pabst Grand Opera House in Milwaukee, with its large German population, is the best known of the grand ethnic opera houses. But the country, especially the Midwest, is dotted with small opera houses in the immigrant community. An example in Nebraska, in the Czech town of Clarkson, a local fraternity, the Czech Local Fraternity Association, ZBJC, built a hall for its activities in the early 20th century, but it was still soon renamed Opera House. This simple utilitarian opera house continues as the center of Czech life in that area. And its well-maintained curtains of Bohemian sites exhibit this town's pride in its Bohemian culture. That is the Karlstein Castle, if anyone knows that. The emergence of opera houses coincided with the explosion of traveling performers whose passion and commitment made it possible for them to endure difficult travel to remote places to perform in these simple halls. No doubt the fact that playing on the road could be lucrative lured many performers to put up with the hardships of travel. In fact, the monetary benefits of performing on the road accounted for many well-known foreign actors and performers like Charles Dickens. And I was mentioning earlier that Charles Dickens very much enjoyed his readings in this country, because he said when he was writing, he was all by himself and imagining what people were thinking about in his books. But however, when he was reading face to face with them, he could see what their emotions were, and he very much enjoyed it, and he was very successful financially too. And then also, this is Sarah Bernhardt. She's quite remarkable. She has one, I think, wooden leg. I mean, she is just remarkable. She was banned from many cities because of her, what they conceived immoral attitudes. And she, so instead, she had a tent built, which is behind her in this photograph. It can seat 6,000 people. And it was took 28 railroad cars to transport it around the country. But she got big audiences, and it worked. Oscar Wilde was also a very colorful visitor from it. He even had a drinking session with the miners in Leadville, Colorado, and very much enjoyed his times here. And then there were people like Adeline Patty traveling to remote places, and some very small. And another aspect of these foreign travelers were both Dickens and Bernhardt were able to erase their debts while performing here. But they and many others were also curious about the new country, especially the Wild West. The railroads with their branch lines were essential for performers to reach these small towns like Willa Cather's Red Cloud. The railroad enticed performers to with reduced rates, special cars, and delayed departures. Even the major guide for theaters in the late 19th century was organized by rail lines. On the left, there's a description of the town, and on the right, that long line, there's a list of all the towns, and the theater people could see exactly what the theater complex might be. But there's called Julius Kahn's Theatrical Guide. And this buxom woman she was advertising the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was quite wonderful. The number of performers traveling the country was astounding. The well-known actors and performers would appear in the cities along the railroad's main lines, while the small opera houses on the branch lines usually enjoyed minor league regional theater and opera companies, of which there were many. Some enterprising opera houses managers even organized circuits of opera houses to attract top performers. And a remarkable number of top performers did play in small places, exposing rural audiences to plays and performers previously only seen in large cities. Alexander Walcott noted that the well-known actress Minnie Madden Fisk, quote, traveled all the highways and byways in this country. Indeed, there are no nooks or crannies she had not explored. She loved traveling to the small towns. Most opera house activities took place in the winter months when farming was slow and before the heat of the summer. Willa Cather recalled, quote, half a dozen times during the winter in the larger towns more often, a traveling stock company settled in the local hotel and thrilled and entertained us for a week. Sometimes it was the Andrews Opera Company, which often had a good voice or two among them and a small orchestra and a painstaking conductor. What good luck, she recalled, to hear those tuneful old operas sung. She was a great fan of the opera house. During a season, there was often a Shakespeare play or two, several Uncle Tom cabins, minstrel shows, and melodramas like East Lynne. This one is one of the most popular melodramas at the time. These melodramas titillated audiences with escapes, chases, and heart-wrenching domestic scenes where the heroine always won. Some small towns were even treated to rural audiences. This is a melodrama, which is only really in the upper part of New England, very rural areas. But these people, there's log going through with the person, and that is quite typical of the rural melodramas. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the hit of the century. It played everywhere, in large cities, small hamlets, and later abroad. An estimated 1.5 million people saw an Uncle Tom's Cabin production in 1902. Its phenomenal success was due to its message, the Aiken script, some good acting and savvy promotion. It aroused the conscience of Americans when they were wrestling with the gnawing problem of slavery and later Reconstruction. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the success story of an opera house, albeit in the guise of a museum. It started in 1852 in George Howard's Troy Museum in Troy, New York. That is the advertisement for their first play in the local newspaper. That adaptation was used for many years done by Mr. Howard's wife's nephew, George Aiken, who adapted the play from Harriet Beecher Stowe's book for a gold watch and $45. This adaptation was used by most troupes for decades. As the years went on and its productions were increasingly dramatized, the play's moral message became obscured. Willa Cather, however, could still hear the barking hounds in the Red Cloud's Uncle Tom Cabin performance she attended 30 years earlier. Competing with opera houses and melodramas for popularity were minstrel shows. Innumerable minstrel shows toured the country in the late 19th and early 20th century. So small opera houses would have several minstrel shows in a season. These shows had a spontaneity with no set plots, speeches, music, or character development, but an engaging verve and humorous banter. They provided entertainment and escape compared to the uplift and beauty that opera houses usually tried to offer. Minstrel shows veered away from the troubling stereotypes of the happy-go-lucky Sambo-era plantation slaves and moved into musicals, ridiculing Jim Crow segregation. There's a lot of research being done on the minstrel and African-American issues. Larger towns on the railroad's main lines, like Fremont, Nebraska, were well-equipped theaters, and educated audiences attracted more sophisticated performances and better-known performers than the small towns. In Fremont, James Wheeler Love, an educator turned real estate magnate, developed the local opera house, not only because he had a strong interest in culture, but also because his wife and daughter were avid theater fans. His daughter even ran the theater for a while. Fremont was unusual in having its own opera and theater companies, and even a theater column, Theater Glints, in the local newspaper, reporting on the gossip of well-known actors like Edwin Booth. Theater became so popular in Fremont that the Fremont Weekly Herald reported on the 1888 opening of the Love Opera House that, quote, theatricals have become an almost indispensable adjunct of civilization. And there was opera, there was real opera. Regional opera companies like Emma Abbott's Grand English Opera Company from Peoria, Illinois, and Andrews Family Opera Company from Minnesota would tour the small towns, while the Metropolitan Opera Company would appear in the major cities on the main lines. Emma Abbott's was a respectable company, usually producing English comic opera, as well as translations of Italian, German, and French operas. There's Emma. Emma was a talented soprano. She studied in Paris and Milan and appeared in Covent Garden. However, she never forgot the heartland, nor her popular touch. She would inject hymns into Faust, which was popular with her audiences, but not with the critics. Another company, the Andrews Family Opera Company, was a humbler operation run by Reverend Andrews with his 12 children. There were so many Americans that come entering at that point that they were so American that they did not hire Enrico Caruso shortly after he arrived in the United States because he did not sing in English. This company preferred Gilbert and Sullivan as well as the grand operas, but always in English. The family historian considered the company's major contribution its performance of grand opera for those whose opportunities to see and hear any form of entertainment, good or bad, was extremely meager. The company conveyed the sense of beauty and inspiration that comes from hearing great music, end quote. This company's history was a ratioalgia story. The troupe began with a little red wagon going down Main Street announcing the upcoming performances, as a circus might do. But after many years of performing, the Andrews Opera Company was traversing the Midwest and beyond in its own Pullman car on a schedule that read like a railroad timetable. Despite the popularization of some operas and the critics' scorn of the Heartland's taste, Omaha and Lincoln, Nebraska did have serious opera performances. In fact, in the 1890s, Nebraska enjoyed a golden era of grand opera. In 1894, Omaha transformed its Coliseum into an opera house for a 5-day opera festival with Adelina Patti as the star transaction. She was very popular. Omaha's children were even given a holiday from school to attend the opera. And not surprisingly, Patti found Omaha to be, unquote, one of the grandest towns in America because its audiences are always appreciative. She must have had quite a range of audiences. Aside from their performances, actors and actresses from the time they stepped off the train in their opera house town until they left, became temporary citizens of those towns. Local residents were thrilled to have these famous and seemingly exotic people in their midst. Willa Cather described the excitement when she and her friends studied the billboards for upcoming plays, then went to the railroad station to watch the troupes live, and followed them to their hotels and later attended their plays. An excitement was in the air when the troupes were in town. Fred Sweet remembered the days of his opera house entertainers in Hampton, Iowa, where he said, our romantic heroes and heroines walked our streets, breathed our air, and ate our food. They were not strips of celluloid packed tightly in tin boxes shipped to us across the country. They were live people performing just for the Hampton audience and thousands of other small towns. The opera house in a small town was a local institution providing far more than culture and entertainment. Before schools had auditoriums, the opera house was virtually an adjunct to the schools. All school plays, recitations, graduations, and debates took place in the opera house. Let's see. In the many flat-floored halls, most school sports, especially basketball, were held in the opera house. And let's see. We have to get Willa Cather in there. All school plays were there. There's one displayed, the actors and actresses displayed above them. In any case, that was Willa Cather in her graduation. Often the largest hall in town, numerous public events such as town meetings and political speakers and election activities took place in the opera house. In fact, the number and frequency of these town activities made the opera house seem like a public building, while the bank, stores, and courthouse were the economic and civic underpinnings of these towns. It was the opera house that often pulled the town together as a community. After flourishing for 40 years or more, the opera house in the early 1900s faced changes that would eventually doom it. Cars, movies, the new school auditorium, less talented troupes, and changing tastes made the Opera House an obsolete institution. Movies were the fatal blow. First, the opera houses tried to show movies, but they were outdone by the new luxurious movie palaces featuring famous film stars in nearby large towns. But for many old towners, the movies did not provide the intimacy and spontaneity of live theater. The strips of celluloid produced, quote, leading ladies who smile for the Hampton audiences just as they do for the city's coast-to-coast Hampton natives, Tread Sweet contended. The emotional current which passed from the live actors to the live audiences in small, intimate spaces was missing in this new era of movies. The actor Joseph Jefferson wrote of missing the lively participation of theater audiences, which would jeer and hiss when he forgot his lines. As that lively participation vanished, so did the opera houses themselves. By World War II, opera houses had mostly disappeared. Many were torn down. Let's see. Yeah, that is in Paris, Kentucky. The tire place, which is a red brick building, has replaced the opera house on the left. Below, the next picture shows in Coldstone, Michigan, a building that this not very large town was able to save or get enough money to totally restore the old building as it was. It's quite an accomplishment. Most of these buildings were torn down, and those that escaped the wrecking ball became warehouses or just empty buildings taken over by bats and pigeons. A few limped along in remote places with few competitive and entertainment venues. The heyday of the opera house was long past. Willa Cather and other opera house enthusiasts who bemoaned the loss of the small town opera house and its live entertainment would be heartened to know that today many small opera houses are coming back to life. Beginning in the 1970s, historic preservationists awakened communities to the possibilities of restoring their dormant opera houses. Their efforts were reinforced by stalwart local activists and theater enthusiasts who, after costly rehabilitation, have brought many abandoned opera houses up to code and even equity standards. Okay, now we move. In the rural towns, some with only 2,000 people, the revived opera house now offers plays, concerts, jazz festivals, dance recitals, operas, and innumerable classes from playwriting to Irish step dancing. Unlike the early days of the opera house, which relied on traveling performers, today's opera houses are fueled by local community creative energy. They have their own theater and opera companies made up of local talent without some outside professionals. Shakespeare, Ibsen, Theodore Williams, and Arthur Wayne blend in with popular musicals and operas. And the talented professionals have been attracted to manage this revived opera houses. Surprising it might be that 47. As surprising it might be, opera now is extremely popular in these revived opera houses. In an hour from Rutland, Vermont, one can attend in the summer grand operas produced by half a dozen opera companies in small towns like Barre, Vermont, Middlebury, Vermont, Lebanon, New Hampshire. Aside from the innumerable culture offered, the opera house in many small places is becoming the center of many arts districts, with galleries, studios, and bookstores, attracting people from miles away to places as different as Spearfish, South Dakota, and Cambridge, New York. A few opera houses have specialized, like Goodspeed in East Haddam, Connecticut, with musical theater, and Central City, Colorado, with its grand opera. Most, however, continue the tradition of blending culture and entertainment. The story of the opera house is an American story. Those local glories resulted from small town entrepreneurs' optimism, pragmatism, and energy, essential ingredients of the American spirit. The opera house entrepreneurs had confidence in the future, and they banked on a community hall with the proud name of Opera House, helping to transform a scraggly community into a civilized town. No lords, wealthy patrons, or hefty government subsidies were here to help, as was often the case in Europe. The same is true today, as most revised opera houses rely on volunteers and private money, with small grants trickling down through state art councils and the NEA. As the 19th century entrepreneurs hoped to civilize their town and put them on the map, Today's revivers hope to resuscitate not only the opera house, but their struggling downtowns. The story reflects the timeless quest of so many different people for cultural nourishment, especially women. In the 19th century, women were behind the curtain, nudging the men in their towns to build opera houses. But today, women are in the forefront of the local campaigns to revive the opera house. And also today's interest in opera house reflects an urge to break away from the virtual world and connect with others in face-to-face ventures. In the 19th century, people with no phones, telephones, much less cell phones and computers, broke out of their isolation to meet friends and neighbors and enjoy entertainment at the opera house. They wanted to connect with worlds far and near. Now the urge is to disconnect from the outside world of mass-produced commercial entertainment, the proliferation of communications, and the remoteness of so many transactions in this digital age. People want to challenge the medium of everyday life. They want to dream and create something positive to share with others. By doing so, they forge connections and engage in community. Today's local glories are again where art and community meet, as these opera houses offer participation in creative ventures and a community of shared interests and revived civility. And this Insight Art Create Community poster was designed by the Stonington, Maine Opera House. I thought it was quite apt. Well, thank you. We missed the politician. It was a burning politician. I don't know how that happened. I mean, it's my questions. What? Sure. How is that, John?
Okay, ask the audience if they have.
Feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions if you have them. That was just tremendous, Anne.
I didn't get that.
She said if anyone has any questions, they're going to ask them now.
Okay. Diana's ready to ask a question.
I could make a comment and ask a question. First, the comparison between opera houses, as you've described, and movie houses. It seems to me that one really big difference is that the opera houses are used for a wide variety of activities. You've mentioned plays, minstrel, music, of course, readings, graduation ceremonies, even roller skating and basketball. And I remember growing up in Portland, Oregon, that on Broadway there were fancy movie houses, and they had big, had lots of neon lights out in front, and they had big, banners over the street and so on. They were really the place to go.
Often with Egyptian architecture too.
That's right. But as far as I know, they were only used for movies. They were set up for movie viewing, and I don't think they were used for much of anything else, which is a big difference between the opera houses of the old days and the movie houses that replaced them. But my question is the term opera house. I mean, I understand that many of these were
simple,
created by immigrants who came from countries in Europe, and opera was part of the life that they led there, and they wanted to recreate that. I don't know about the opera houses in Europe, whether they were used for things other than music, but certainly here they were used for this wide variety of things. Do you happen to know where this term opera house for these facilities in the US happened to originate?
Well, there's been a lot of research on that, but I would say nothing has been very successful in finding. I think the immigrant influence had a great deal to do with it, though.
So what is the earliest opera house that you know of?
For culture. There was a real quest for culture. They were in these isolated, backwater towns, and so to have a little troupe come to town, and also a public hall where they could have all their public meetings. All the voting took place in these halls. There was almost a public institution. Whereas the movie theaters never had that role. I mean, there was a wonderful extravagance about those big movie halls. And that was a major attraction, as the entertainment started to wane in the opera houses, the nearby cities had these luxurious Egyptian style palaces for the movies, and it was quite an attraction. And interestingly enough, I don't know how many read it in the New York Times on Sunday, in the review section, they Satterthwaite, I don't know quite how to pronounce his name, had a long piece on the end of the movie era. And I thought it was quite, I think he's correct. I think the large type of movie theater that there were in the 30s and 40s is no more. And he did not go into what might be replacing the opera house in the theaters, but I think there's going to be much more smaller scale theaters like the Avalon here, which more community oriented, and which would also feature more documentary films. They didn't have to be great splashy things. And I think after the slap in the face at the Oscars, that it's an indication that the big movie may be on the decline. But it is interesting. I tried to find out the source of the opera house. There's been some speculation, but there's nothing. I think it really did come from the foreign influences. I mean, these people, some of them had these halls, some of them had built rooms in the town halls where they used, but they weren't called opera houses. I think it was also a way of getting away from the puritanical and Quaker restrictions on theater, that if you called it something an opera house, it seemed a little more uplifting than if you just called it a theater. But when Katharine Hepburn in the 1930s told her father that she wanted to go into the theater, her father said, "Oh, along with the other streetwalkers." Oh. Which, to give you an idea of the attitude toward this, is in the 1930s. And so the opera house added a sort of a uptown tone to the building, and I think got away from the attitude toward theater, which were very severe. I mean, when troops coming to this country never went north. They would land in Philadelphia somewhere. They would head immediately to the South, because the South did welcome culture, and they had some opera houses, independent opera houses, but a lot of the musical events took place in people's parlors in the plantation houses. But there was not the attitude. They were favorably, that kind of culture was favorably viewed in the South. But in the North, I mean, in Philadelphia, the first theater was called the Southwark, and that's because it was built just south of the borderline of the city of Philadelphia, which banned theater. I mean, we have no idea how serious that was. I think so. Dan, I do think that is an aspect of this opera house coming up as such a popular term for cultural buildings. So I'll do more research, though. There are tens of thousands of these opera houses, and when writing this book and doing my research, it was sort of overwhelming. So I selected 4 states which I thought had special individual qualities which the others didn't have. One was Vermont, because it was a northern state and a puritanical state, and it was one of the first to have opera houses in the city halls. I wanted to look into the changing attitudes toward theater, and that was the one state in New England which was supporting the opera house. I also took Kentucky, because it was one of the first states to have theater. They even had theater on their within their county courthouses, and the courthouse steps in the summer they would have theater. And there was very early theater, and there were several theater troupes also in Kentucky. And there was Colorado, which had very early theater. They had 2 circuits, a gold and silver circuit, and they had some entrepreneurs like in Leadville and Aspen who were very interested in theater and saw it also as a promotion to their communities. And Nebraska I took because every single town in the state had an opera house. There were thousands of them, and great many, I would say almost a third of them are probably immigrant opera houses because they were strong. And that was, and Willa Cather was from Red Cloud, Nebraska, and she was a big supporter of the local opera house. When the 1940s, she wrote a letter to the Omaha newspaper saying that she traveled the small towns of Nebraska and was saddened to see very few opera houses. So she would be delighted to know what's happened in the last 50 years, because it was not happening in her later years. But in any case, there are thousands of opera houses, and there's many opportunities for further research, which would be of interest. This is just touching the very beginning of the thing, but it was a very interesting research, and I had a lot of fun doing it. And there's tremendous pride and effort. And I do think these businessmen saw the opera house as a stepping stone for that community becoming more important in the county and the state, and they wanted to be the state capital. They were fighting over who was going to get the opera house. But in any case, and the railroads were obviously very supportive. Here's a question. Carol
Yes.
has a question.
Hi, I'm Carolyn. I just commend you for the research you've done, Ms. Satterthwaite. These have been amazing photos and stories of the infinite variety of opera houses, which I think I agree with you. They're treasures of our community and of high and low culture. When I was in Ohio a couple of years ago, I'm trying to remember, in Columbus, Ohio, there is a place called Germantown. It's a section of the city, and they have an amazing, what they called opera house there. And like the apartment building that my daughter lives in, which in Brooklyn, which is also an old opera house, it had a huge beer garden as part of this wonderful old buildings, and they are set back from the street. They actually have, unlike some of the homes, like some of the buildings we saw, they are set back so that they can accommodate a garden, a beer garden. Do you see a lot of that, or have you seen? Is that?
I didn't see that much of that.
Yes.
The larger cities that had the big German populations would, I think, have that. The smaller ones had a tougher time sort of mobilizing. And there's a lot of competition who's going to be the Czech queen for each year and whatnot.
Yeah.
It's quite business oriented. But the larger cities, I think, like Brooklyn, it's interesting that the German community didn't maintain that building. But, yeah. In Columbus, are they apartment buildings?
No, it's actually they've done a wonderful job of maintaining that community, and it's a huge tourist center. It's not just the opera house. It's restaurants, and it's churches, and it's the way the original community was, and they've kept it as a showcase.
And so that had always been the German ethnic neighborhood.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Interesting.
All red brick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the opera house wasn't sort of an early bit. The promoters of opera houses were certainly involved in their community development issues. And it's been interesting to see how that's worked out. Some of the places are too close to each other. In Vermont, Middlebury has a very talented man who's been in the theater running their theater, and they've done a very good job in the town hall theater. And not too far away, the next town is Vergennes, and that had an opera house which was part of a city hall, and they've had a hard time competing with the town hall in Middlebury. And so I think in a lot of these places, I think the tourist factor has been very important. And the development issues. I mean, these have been economic development issues in many places, which would surprise someone like Willa Cather, who saw them fading away. No, but they are multi-purpose operations, all right. So
I'm sorry, here, I have another question.
that's permitted, I think.
She unmuted herself.
Oh, she unmuted herself, or did I?
She did.
Wait a minute. I'm unmuted. Could you tell us how your interest evolved? How did you become interested in this subject?
Oh, because I have a brother who teaches at Williams College, and there's a town not too far from where he lives, which has opera houses in Cambridge, New York. It's halfway between Saratoga and Bennington, and so there is a sort of a cultural community there. But it was called the Opera House. And I kept going around finding places which had these little buildings, many abandoned, with opera house. So that's how I got into it. I was just a curiosity about the whys and wherefores of opera houses. And I found it sort of overwhelming, frankly. There are thousands of them. And when I was doing my research, the State Historic Preservation Offices had not done much research on them. So I had to dig around for information. The historical people were just sort of getting into the interest in the opera house and seeing how important it was for the tourism of the state as well as its culture. I mean, these places they're just a remarkable array of events, and so that's how I got into it. And in the end of my book, I said I had an appendix for each state's listing of its opera houses that both the state and I found. Many, many more are around, and they need to be recorded. And so I just touched the surface of the opera houses. There's a very interesting research that could yet be done on them. And you could just take one type of opera house and do it. But not all have all the community activities. The Hubbard Hall near my brother's, I mean, they now have a man who had been head of the arena stage. He'd been the artistic director of the arena stage, and he wanted to live in a small town. Had young children. He wanted to bring them up. He has theater writing classes in the high school. My gosh, he's got everything going. And there are people you would never suspect. I went to a play there, and I sat next to a farmer. And I said, why, how do you happen to be here? And he said, my granddaughter's here. He said, I never thought I'd ever be going in this building. And I said, how do you found? He said, I think it's quite exciting seeing what's going on. So it's reawakened a lot of smallish places in this town, in the country. So now that you know of them, you'll see them when you drive around. The state of West Virginia is tourist office and historic preservation office joined together to have a tour of opera houses. They had a tour of FDR buildings. They've had this is statewide, and they had some very interesting, very rural in the mountainous area of West Virginia opera houses. I thought that was quite clever. That could be done in many places. Yeah. In the summer, you can spend a weekend in the country and get a little culture.
I'm actually going to be in West Virginia this summer, so I'm going to do that.
Well, look it up, because I thought it looked very. They have tremendous range of them too. Some are very fancy, some are very simple, and I bet there were 8 of them. I thought it was a good idea. Every time I get a brochure from West Virginia, I keep thinking they might peddle it, but they don't. I don't know why they don't. I thought the FDR tour would be interesting too.
Yeah.
See what was being built at that era.
Right.
So in any case, well, if you're interested, there's lots of research, and there's much more research available than when I started. As I said, the State Historic Preservation Offices had very little on that. And that was really also because the towns themselves have to initiate the projects to get the state interest. And they hadn't, they're just starting to do that now. So I'm going to look up your daughter's place in Brooklyn, though. I'm interested.
Yeah.
In Columbus.
Are there any other questions out there?
What's that?
She's saying, are there any other questions?
Oh, no, I think that seems exhaustive.
Very good.
Well, thank you very much. It's a nice opportunity to discuss a good.
Yeah, I'm gonna go
Yeah,
back
that's
up
okay.
and show them that one. So they can write
Wonderful.
it down.
You know, that's the cover of the book. I had
Oh,
I had a copy. I think I brought a copy with me.
Mm.
I want to thank you, Anne, for this wonderful talk.
yes.
It has just
Well,
been eye-opening, all these
I'm
little,
involved with the Georgetown village, so it's nice to be able to have hands across.
Show them how thick it is.
Yeah. Now, this is.
and I want to invite everyone out there to take a look at our website. If there are any other talks coming up, please feel free to register. Our next special talk will be with Deborah Bevelert, playwright who wrote Oh, What a Night. And I encourage you to join us for that one.
Thank you both. And thank you, Dan.
You're welcome. And thank you, Anne. She's the one who did the
Wonderful
program.
presentation.
Thank you. Yes,
Very nice.
excellent. Excellent.